Well, hello everybody, friends and colleagues, and you're all very welcome to this special conversation to celebrate the unveiling, finally, of the wonderful 4 new sculptures of women in Trinity's Long Room in the library. My name is Eve Patton. I'm director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is Trinity's Arts and Humanities Research Institute, for those of you who haven't been with us before. We work with our partner schools in the arts and humanities in research, and we also work very closely with the library, liaising on research and on projects and on events. So it's a real pleasure today to be part of this story and to be able to think yet again, given our investment in the arts and humanities, about just how well and just how effectively the visual arts can speak to our current emotional and social and moral conditions, as they've done with these 4 wonderful new commissions. I want to congratulate everyone who's been involved in this, and I know that's very many people across college and beyond. I have to say that I wasn't prepared last night for just how emotional it would be when the first sculpture of Mary Wollstonecraft was unveiled. A real shiver ran through the room, a shiver of absolute delight. And I actually have to confess, I also wasn't prepared for how much I now covet a genuine Rosalind Franklin crystal necklace. But I bet I'm not the only one who's been thinking that. But as I took some time to walk around last night and look at the 4 new sculptures, a line kept coming to me from W.B. Yeats, from his last poems, and that wonderful long poem, Under Ben Bulbin, where he gives the future artists instructions on how they must take responsibility for building up the culture of the new nation. And I thought about how Yeats specifically calls out the sculptors to come to that responsibility. Poet and sculptor do the work. There is no doubt that the work has been done. Rowan, Guy, Maudie and Vera have done the work for us now, and the results are absolutely compelling. I've no doubt that these 4 commissions have already and will continue to capture hearts and minds across college and beyond. And we can now see 4 great women right at the beating heart of Trinity, which is the library, which is the Long Room. I'm now going to hand over to a 5th great woman who, since she arrived in Trinity, has completely reimagined what our library is and what it stands for. So without further ado, our librarian and college archivist, Helen Shenton.
Eve, thank you so much for those generous words. So, welcome everyone to we're going to have this as a very informal conversation. And I hope everyone has, if not already, visited the 4 new sculptures, that you will visit them in the Long Room. And as you know, it's been a very long-held ambition of ours to introduce women into that iconic row of men. It didn't so much take a village as a small town. And I'm not going to rehearse all the thank yous, but I would put a great shout out actually to the previous provost, Patrick Prendergast, who helped navigate this process, and to Catherine Giltrap, who's the curator who has seen all this through, and a huge shout out to everyone who has then been involved. So, how we're going to do this, and we are under the gun slightly. I have to get the Vice Provost out the door to St James's Hospital. So we have 8 speakers, so we're going to zip through this. And what we've got is 4 trios, if you like. So we have our woman scholar. Then we have asked one of our phenomenal Trinity scholars to champion them and say not only about the person, but why they are inspired, personally inspired, for about 5 minutes. Then we hand over to the artist, who I'm going to say what inspired you about your artistic response to that particular person, particularly in terms of materials and techniques. So we've got a lot to get through. So without more ado, we're going to start with Mary Wollstonecraft. And I'm going to invite Gail McElroy to come and join me. And Rowan Gillespie. So, and I'm not going to do long introductions. You've all got phones. Please just check out who people are and everything like that. So Gail McElroy is our Dean of Arts and Humanities, Professor in Political Science and doyen of CNN. Whenever I turn on CNN, it's fantastic. She is our commentator. And one comment I'll make about Gail was involved when we had the nominations. So, we had about 500 nominations. And Gail was on that committee. And she spoke about Mary Wollstonecraft. And I was bowled over. So, 5 minutes, Gail. What inspires you about Mary, both personally and professionally?
So, it's a really great pleasure to be here today. And thank you for the opportunity. And I'm really glad to be sharing this experience with Rowan Gillespie. He's one of my favourite sculptors. I was thrilled when I learned that he was chosen to bring Mary Wollstonecraft to life. So fabulous. And the unveiling last night was remarkable. You've really managed to embody her spirit as I think of her. So fabulous and well done.
Thank you.
And the question we were kind of tasked with today was, how were you inspired by this scholar, both academically and personally? Which brought me back to my original motivation for nominating Mary Wollstonecraft in 2019. One of those kind of pub conversations with a colleague, Professor Darrell Jones, who's a professor of English. It turned out we were both huge Mary Wollstonecraft fans. She's so remarkable that she manages to bring together a professor of Gothic fiction and a hard-nosed quantitative political scientist like me. She is multidisciplinary in our own academic language. Mary Wollstonecraft was a novelist, a political theorist, a feminist, an educationalist. And she accomplished so much against extreme odds. And she's really inspired me. She had a very short life, 38 years, tragically ending in death shortly after giving childbirth. But we still kind of feel the impact of her 225 years after this death. So what inspired me academically? Her productivity. She put many of us to shame. She was really, really prolific in her short life. She wrote novels, treatises, a travel narrative, a history of the French Revolution, a children's book, a conduct book, the list goes on. And she also endlessly wrote letters to her siblings, to her intellectual peers, dissenters of the time, and her friends. And actually it makes for a very rich biography if you're interested in her. All that being said, for me, she's a feminist philosopher, first and foremost, the first real one, and that's what inspires me the most. Her most famous text, if you're not familiar with it, is A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. And it is a passionate feminist declaration of independence, a manifesto for women, centuries ahead of its time. She argues, and I think this is what makes her a really good match with the long room, she argues for the emancipation and particularly the education of women. She makes this radical argument, radical at the time, and actually probably radical to people like Andrew Tate, that women are not naturally inferior to men. She argues also, but she's got kind of a socialist tendencies. It wouldn't have been defined as such at the time, but she argues for state-funded mixed-sex education schools and a woman's right to earn money for herself. And her own life was marked by this constant financial struggle to earn an income and not to be dependent on her relatives and men. She really saw women as kind of rational individuals with their own agency and also their own desires. They weren't created for the entertainment of men. She really kind of rails against Rousseau's version of Sophie as this kind of ideal coquettish partner for Emile. And she really sees it as for the good of society because she sees this incredible waste of potential when women aren't educated. And, just to quote her, how many women thus waste life away, the pyre of discontent, who might have practiced as physicians, regulated a farm, or managed a shop, or been an academic. She didn't actually say that last bit, but she advocated for property rights for women. She even said they should be represented in government. And she kind of railed against also kind of primogeniture and inherited property. There were other people writing at the time about women's rights, but she was by far the most radical. She was unique in that she considered kind of the woman's condition economic, psychological, and cultural. It's really, really remarkable texts. So what I love about her is that she is righteous and radical and angry. She was the 18th century's nasty woman. She was badly treated at the time, and she still continued in the face of being called, derided as a hyena in petticoats. I also think, as an aside, it's worth mentioning that Mary Wollstonecraft has Irish connections. Her mother was from Ballyshannon, and she spent a year in Ireland. She hated it, but she was a governess to Lord and Lady Kingsborough, and she really, really disliked the period. She may have, she was suffering from melancholy or depression perhaps at the time. Her siblings started schools in Dublin, and I was fascinated to learn that her sister Everina was a governess in a manor house literally 2 kilometres from the homeland in which I grew up. It's extraordinary links. She also has an indirect link to Trinity, which wasn't a criteria for nomination. I was delighted to see last night she's only 2 stalls down from the man she railed against, Edmund Burke. So one of her most influential early pieces was Reflections on the Revolution. Was a response to Reflections on the Revolution in France. In this book, Burke, he defends monarchy, he defends aristocracy, he defends the status quo. And Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a response, a vindication of the rights of men, in which she sees Burke as kind of a venal opportunist. And she poses a vision of society which people are rewarded for their entrepreneurial spirit, and that underprivileged children could compete against the wrongly privileged. Finally, kind of on a more personal note, and I am wrapping up, I wonder would I have liked Mary as a friend and a colleague, I'm not entirely sure. There's a great biography of her by Janet Todd, and it's clear from this that she's a very complex individual. Brilliant, energetic, curious, generous, adventurous, very, very brave. She was also self-regarding, snobbish, melancholic, and quick to find faults in others. But I think she was so atypical of women of her time. She had so much to overcome that only a woman as complex as that could have achieved what she did. So today and last night, we rightly honour this woman who was born into a class-bound, male-dominated society. She overcame childhood poverty, childhood cruelties, and a miserable education to make a lasting impact on the world. And I just kind of finally end with this. I think she'd love the attention we're giving her. And she didn't get it, and the attention and recognition she deserved in her own lifetime. So I end with the last line from my nomination form. Mary Wollstonecraft embodies the spirit of Trinity as a woman who fearlessly engaged in actions that advanced the cause of a pluralistic and just society. Thank you.
Gail, that was brilliant. And I always learn so much. And just to let everyone know, we're filming this, so it will all be available so as we can hear you again. That's great. And it just occurs to me that of the 4 women, 3 died at 37 or 38. Just laying that out there. Amazing. So, Rowan, I'm absolutely intrigued to hear. And so your response, and obviously you could choose which of our 4 scholars as well, and your response, your artistic response, as we know, you used Carrara marble, which isn't your normal technique. So please.
Well, I think I really did not think I would even put forward an idea for this project, because I don't work in marble, I work in bronze. And if you think how dark bronze looks, there's no way you could have 4 women in bronze or 1 in the middle with all of those white Carrara heads. It was quite by chance that I was over in Wales and putting up a bronze sculpture where somebody said to me, do you know I happen to have 7 ton of Carrara marble? Are you interested? And the stuff was out about this commission, and I remember thinking, God, she could make quite a few mistakes and still get a sculpture by the end of it all. So I thought, well, I better practice. I better make a little head, and I did. I kind of carved one. first thing I've done in marble since art college, and it sort of came out okay. So then the thing that maybe people aren't fully aware of is that we could all put in 2 different people, and I think each one of us was very obsessed by one. For me, it was Rosalind Franklin. But then I had another one to put in, and I sort of quite casually thought, well, Mary Wollstonecraft's interesting. So in it went. And in a typical sort of university academic way, the panel decided to give each one of us the person we didn't choose. And it was a very smart move, because we were right outside our comfort zone. I was suddenly with this Lyndon Gordon book about Mary Wollstonecraft, and the vindication of the rights of women. I mean, it made Ulysses look like a weekend supplement, what I had to read. And you're launching off on basically doing a PhD on this person. And there was so much, I think, as Gail is saying, there's so much sort of conflicting information about it. There's very few images of Mary Wollstonecraft, and they don't seem to be accurate when I read what she did look like, what she felt she looked like. So I think it meant that it was necessary to go down another road with her. And I did like her a lot. Anybody who met my mother would know that I like strong women, so that wasn't new to me, the strength in her. But I found her very sensitive, and I suppose the kind of that she wasn't. She was banging her fists on the table all the time in what she wrote. But as a woman, she was a real woman. She was a real sensitive woman. The 2 suicide attempts. Now, I lost both my sister and my brother-in-law to suicide. So I think that gave a way in. And the thinking that if she had been successful with one of those, what we would have lost. And then I thought about these people I know who've taken their lives. They always seem to be the most brilliant people around. And for some reason, they throw it away. So I found a way in with that, with the idea that really she was a visionary. So for me, within the space I had, everything had to go up. Everything had to be looking, dreaming of a better future. And I found her a person who, it wasn't like there was any complexity around her beliefs. She simply saw right and wrong. She simply saw, I think I was very taken by her when it came to inheritance and so on. The way the family name is more important than the individuals within the family. You've got to preserve the name. And there she is, and you look at what's going on in the royal family in the UK, and you realise that we still haven't got there. We still haven't got as far as she was back in 1770. So I would be thanking Trinity for having given me the opportunity to actually learn about somebody who I knew so little about before, and made it possible for me to go on an amazing journey. So, thank you.
Rowan, that was absolutely riveting and extremely moving. Thank you for sharing that about your own family. That's very, very, very moving. And as chair of the selection committee, so colleagues, what happened was that we had the maquettes and 2 from each person. And then it was one of the first on-campus events as we came out of COVID, and it was in the Provost House. And it was a highlight of the year for me, of that COVID year, because we then had all the maquettes, and then it was a question of choosing the different artists, the different responses, and then who would do whom. And I hadn't realised we'd basically chosen all for all of you, your second choices.
Very clever.
Well, serendipity, I think. So, Gail and Rowan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow. So now we're going to have Augusta Gregory, and I'm going to invite probably the world expert on Augusta Gregory, Associate Professor in Drama Studies, Melissa Silva, and your challenge is going to be, in 5 minutes, in that you probably know more than anyone in the world and are so enthusiastic about Augusta Gregory, is to share that with us. And then I'll pass over to Guy, who will talk about his fabulous limewood sculpture.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's impossible to do this, so it's a very huge challenge. I'm honoured that I had the chance to be there last night. And it was, for me, it was a moment that occurred in Trinity College which could never have happened before, because not only did we have the first ever sculptures of women, these iconographies, we also had the first ever provost being a woman, and Helen being the librarian, and the chancellor being a woman, Mary McAleese, and Linda Doyle. So that lineage of women opening up and unveiling women, for me, is one of the most powerful moments of my life. Augusta Gregory was a visionary genius and a gifted artist. Like the tales that reverberate in the many folklore stories that she collected, she was able to see beyond the immediate realm of needs and necessities in the everyday practicalities of life to the fabric of things as yet only dreamt of or unspoken in Irish theatre and culture. That gift as a visionary of the intellect of the modern emerging Ireland. She had a unique poetic gift of language. She was committed to the Irish language, as Mary McAleese pointed out last night, and was the first writer to invent the Hiberno-English dialect with glorious rhythm and cadence, which went on to influence, in particular, John Millington Synge. This trajectory of influence has been subsumed so that we think these dialects and her speech was originated with Synge, but actually she was the genesis of this poetic form for the stage. He called her book, Cuchulainn of Murhimna, his daily bread. And in the preface to this 1902 book, W.B. Yeats states, "I think this book is the best book that has come out of Ireland in my time. Perhaps I should say it is the best book to ever have come out of Ireland." Her reach and influence was global. Theodore Roosevelt kept this book on his bedside table, and she was a gifted public speaker and gave many lecture tours around America and was very famous in America, with paparazzi approaching her in the Algonquin Hotel. And she had this fame in America because it was less gender-based and more egalitarian in terms of gender. So she was more famous than Yeats in the States, whereas it was different here. Here, until very recently, she has been traditionally considered as a supporter to men of genius, as an organizer, as a theatre manager, as a practical person. But actually, it is all of them who are indebted and were in awe of her. Yeats admitted this in his journal, in his private journal, that she was a gifted playwright. More gifted, there were the three original directors of the Abbey Theatre, herself, John Millington Synge, and Yeats. And he says that no one would surpass her on the stage. Her creative and scholarly output is extraordinary, like Mary Wollstonecraft, like the other women that we're going to hear about. She was author of over 50 published books and plays, Irish myths and translations, folklore, a history of the Abbey Theatre, poetry, biographies and autobiography, 3 volumes of personal journals. All of this without a formal education, without a third-level education, without being permitted to get a third-level education. This is the effect of a brilliant, astute, and creative mind. She began to make a living from her published works, and when first paid, she always went first and bought seeds and planted trees. She did that before buying food. And that is a testimony to her awareness of legacies and the future and the landscape of Ireland in every sense, literally, culturally, intellectually. Her achievements were often sidelined and minimised during her life, as is the case for so many great women in history. How do you compete with the imposing, overarching shadows of male figures in a male world, particularly W.B. Yeats? They co-authored the most important play in Irish theatre history, and they had a very significant, close, artistic, collaborative relationship. They co-authored Kathleen Ní Houlihan, but she was never acknowledged as the author in her lifetime. And this only emerged with manuscript evidence in 1988. In her journals, she records to her personally that this was very hard on her during her lifetime. And she did resent this erasure from the authorship of this most popular play of the Abbey Theatre. Lady Gregory famously tells us that we must, quote, question the beaten path of authorised history. And this is what we are doing now, in immortalising her, in full recognition of her and these other women's achievements from under the veil. We are challenging these previously unquestioned, well-trodden patriarchal paths of history, what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the single story. I'm lucky enough now in Trinity College to explore her story and so many stories of women in Irish theatre with my students, and we go on these journeys together. When I was an undergraduate at Trinity College, Irish theatre history was all male. We did not study Lady Gregory's plays or any plays by women. Yet her plays were the most popular of the Abbey Theatre the first 2 decades. Her plays kept the theatre open. We wouldn't have the Abbey Theatre without her box office returns. History and cultural production must always be challenged, and we are challenging it, and I challenge it in my work through this rediscovery of Lady Gregory and her influence and achievements. She is the genesis of modern Irish theatre, and indeed, one could say, of modern Ireland. She was passionate, complex, hilarious, irreverent. I would love to have known her. I feel I would have got on with her. She was truly dedicated to her art, calling playwriting like fire in the blood. On a personal note, as a woman in Ireland today, she gives me an origin point, one that I didn't have as a student. She gives women and young women, and me, not a young woman, a place in Irish theatre and in Irish history that we never had, a lineage. She is a true role model for past and present and future, and is what George Bernard Shaw called the greatest living Irish woman of her time. Thank you. And I'd just like to congratulate Guy on your beautiful piece, and it's so moving and extraordinary. And we were talking last night, but it is made of wood, and her trees were so beloved to her, so this is really appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm a limewood sculptor, and I have to be honest with you, if I had done Ada Lovelace or Mary Wollstonecraft, I would have made them in limewood. But this history of Augusta Gregory and her love of trees, her love of walking in the Seven Woods and her estate, added a dimension to the piece, I felt. I'm a reader of images, really. I'm not an academic. I'm not a particularly intellectual person. I'm a reader of images. I'm a reader of faces. I'm a reader of hands. And she was so extraordinary in these images we have of her, this documented photographic images. She's a woman I feel, of great paradox. Somebody who could look so fierce and yet have a smile. You sense she laughed a lot. She has lines around here that tell you she laughed a lot. I felt she loved a lot. I felt she didn't suffer fools gladly, but at the time she was probably forgiving of fools too. I felt something very modern about her. She's a woman, I suspect, who woke up in the morning and just put her hair up. Bam, bam, bam. And probably didn't look in the mirror. she has an intelligent face, and yes, she's so interesting to work with. And I've never done a dead person before, and it opened my mind, that experience, actually, because I hadn't really it never occurred to me that you can make a dead person somehow perhaps live a little bit, and I felt I'd gone on a journey with her for the months that I was working on her, and I felt accompanied. So it was great. It was a great privilege. I was also, discovered today that Mary Wollstonecraft had Irish links, but it did seem to me a huge honour, to be honest with you, to have been chosen to do Augusta Gregory as perhaps the only Irish subject. It was. I don't know what else I can add. I mean, of course, that she was an amazing, a very significant person for the Irish literary revival. I knew a bit about her before I received the commission because I'd read a biography of Yeats, and I knew a little bit about the Abbey Theatre. A wonderful subject to have been chosen to do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think all of us are learning so much about so many different aspects. But thank you both very much indeed. So moving on swiftly, we're now going to talk about Ada Lovelace. And we have we've got Carol O'Sullivan, Professor of Visual Computing, and we did suspect during the nomination process that there was a campaign by the computer science students, because I will share with you we had more nominations than anyone else for Ada. Anyway, we're very, very honoured to have Professor O'Sullivan. And then we got Maudie Brady, our artist. So could I invite you to say what it is that inspires you?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be a champion for Ada Lovelace. She was born as Augusta Ada Byron, so she's actually the daughter of Lord Byron, and this overshadowed a lot of her childhood in particular because he was quite a scandalous individual. So her mother was called Annabel Milbank Byron, and they actually got legally separated just a month or two after Ada was born, and because of all the scandals, which I won't go into now, but they were even scandalous even for nowadays. He left the country shortly afterwards. He was hounded away, and he never saw Ada again, and he died when she was 8 years old. But she seems to still have kept an affection for him despite this, and called her own children after him, one called Gordon, one called Byron, and she's buried beside him at her request when she passed away. So she was his only legitimate child, but she did have connections with her siblings as well from his other relationships. Yeah. So she's also one who died at age 36, but she lived quite a life, and even though she was born into wealth and an aristocratic background, she had a very difficult childhood, and her mother was apparently very religious and strict woman, and nobody really understands why Lord Byron married her, and she was very bitter after he left, and she was determined that Ada wouldn't develop his temperament and his moral vicissitude, if that's the right word. So she was also quite an ill child when she was younger. So she did things like confine her to bed for over a year to see if that would kind of improve her temperament. She believed wonderful Victorian child-rearing techniques. Yeah. But what she also thought was that the study of mathematics and science would make her would distract her mind or improve her temperament so that she'd be focusing on these scientific things. And that's actually the best favour she did her, even if it was meant to be a cure for moral turpitude or whatever. And Ada really loved her studies, and even when she was ill, there's a record of her designing a flying device, where she designed the wing mechanism and steam to power it and things like that. I don't know if she ever tried it, but it does show kind of an early imagination. And she was trained by a woman called Mary Somerville, who was an astronomer and the first member of the Royal Astronomical Society, and was friends for life. And Mary Somerville introduced her when she was about 17 or 18 to the mathematician Charles Babbage, who is sometimes called the father of the computer. So he had already invented and built this difference engine, which was basically a large mechanical device that could crunch numbers. Yeah, so it was basically for calculations. And Ada was very fascinated with this, and then started to work with Babbage, and who introduced her to some professors in the University of London. So she was studying with some quite famous mathematicians of the day. When Charles Babbage then invented another engine called the analytical engine, which is also a large calculating device, and Ada was also very interested in this, and she translated a article by an Italian mathematician about this analytical engine, which was never actually built. But she also wrote a large number of notes to it, which were actually longer than the technical description itself. And within this, there was some really visionary insights that were way ahead of her time. She saw beyond the number crunching aspects of the device and the mechanics of the device, which was what everybody was focusing on, including Babbage himself, and wrote a description of what is basically considered to be the first computer program, okay, where she introduced this concept of repeating a set of instructions. But not only that, so she also considered herself as a poetic scientist, maybe coming from her dad. So she could see parallels between these numbers and these number crunching devices and things like weaving and looms. Plus also she's known for talking about maybe if those numbers, if we weren't talking about numbers but symbols and notes and sounds, a computer could in the future compose a beautiful piece of music or whatever, And that was really visionary from the time, and the mathematicians themselves didn't see that, So she saw beyond this to the abstraction, and maybe it is the combination of being the daughter of a poet and the mathematical rigor that she got. I think that put her very much apart from other young women of her day, I think this interdisciplinary sort of... I'm also started off as a mathematician, but I'm okay now. But actually what attracted me to mathematics, and that was in the days before, girls had a lot of access to computers, and actually most people had a lot of access to computers. But I also was interested in a lot of other things. But the aspects of mathematics I liked were that logical programming. That's what attracted me, and that's why I'm a computer scientist now. So I think she's an inspiration. She got very little recognition during her time, except for because of being Byron's daughter. And some people say that Charles Babbage used her a little bit because of her profile, but most historians, even though maybe she wasn't the most amazing mathematician ever, they do see that vision and this ability to abstract and see beyond as a large contribution. And she was rediscovered in the 1950s, so she didn't really get much fame at all during her lifetime. She was rediscovered in the 1950s, where people could see what great inspiration and visionary she was. And actually, I have a show and tell of a copy of that paper that she wrote, this monograph that she wrote, the translation plus her own notes, that our own Professor Byrne, John Byrne, who's also known as the father of computer science in Ireland, he bought this in 1959. He was a great collector of items and he bequeathed it to the department. So I have it here. I probably should be, I'm in the presence of a librarian. Later you can have a look at it, yeah? I hope Dan McCarthy and Adele don't find out I've taken this away. But it's just for a little bit of local touch, yeah? So that's it. So thank you very much.
Carol, thank you so much for that. So I'm going to ask, so what really spoke to you and inspired you then when you were doing Ada?
I felt with Ada, she's quite a complex character. I know this has been spoken about with the other artists as well a bit, but I think there was the depth of her vision, as you say, was influenced by this poetic upbringing that she obviously was quite attached to as an identity. I think her need for the father and wanting to stay connected to him in the ways that you spoke about. But I feel like that was her desire to maintain a sense of poetry in her life, even though she was sort of taken into the realm of mathematics. I'm sure those two things wove together quite beautifully in her mind or her soul, I guess. And I guess when I looked at, the representations that I was looking at for the artwork were, of course, illustrations mostly, but there was one photo that I'm not even sure if it's actually of her, but it was a black and white photo, which is where I got the hairdo from, the hairstyle. There was a look in her face that was, she was a very, very intelligent person, but there was a vulnerability there that I really wanted to kind of find that mixture of someone who, could outthink a lot of the people around her, but she had this need for, this life in her, this need for sort of poetry and the expression of art and wanting to create a flying machine. That story is just brilliant to me because, what else would you want after being in bed for a year? But yeah, like this kind of, I guess you would call it the helicopter perspective, where you can get a bit of distance from something and see a bigger picture in a whole different way, like out of the box. Yeah, out of the box. And so I saw that in her face. I just could get this sense of this extreme vision inside a very logical mind, very clear intelligence. But yeah, so that's what I was trying to sort of find. The gaze in the sculpture that I did, I was wanting a piercing gaze. I wanted her to look intelligent and like discerning. But I also wanted a bit of vulnerability there, which is why there's a little bit of sort of, the eyebrows are slightly going up in the middle. There's a little bit of vulnerability there. That I was hoping to bring to the piece. And I remember Catherine talking about the maquette, and it was like she was saying, we sort of like that look, that looks a bit sort of not morose, but there was something, there was an expression of like, pensive. That was the word. Pensive. Yeah, pensiveness to.
Sense of the vision that you were talking about.
Yeah, like kind
looking
of
beyond.
Looking beyond,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I hope that comes across, because when you have a maquette and then you do a bigger version, it is a different sculpture. You're trying to replicate the maquette, of course, but it does become a different thing. I made a bigger sculpture in clay, which I then had scanned, and then that was milled into Carrara marble. Well, statuary white marble from Carrara. So it's not technically Carrara marble, which has a grey fleck through it, but this was a piece of white statuary marble from Carrara, which I wanted it to be white because I was thinking about the room, what Rowan was saying, you walk into this room, you don't want a dark sculpture amongst a row of white sculptures. It's just like, no, it has to be white, it has to be marble. I mean, that was my impulse anyway, so that's why I followed the marble thing. And of course, with the new technologies of today, it was possible for me to actually do that because I'm not a marble carver, I also do clay for bronze, so that's my normal material base. But I've done one marble sculpture traditionally, and you have to create a clay, you make a plaster, you take points. It's quite mathematical. It's quite a mathematical process. And what they've done today is they've now got the computer doing the same thing. It's just a bit faster.
I think she'd love that.
It's a bit yeah, exactly. It's like, let's speed this up. Let's get to the end sooner so we can see the art. Yeah, and it was a nice sort of thread going through the whole process when I was thinking about the scanning and the computer stuff. It was, yeah.
Maudie, that's so insightful. I love that linkage through with the technology, and let's speed this up.
Yeah, but this whole thing with AI now, it's incredible what's happening now in the art. In art, AI is creating art now. I don't know if you've been watching the programs that have been making paintings. AI is, you just feed in a few keywords, and suddenly you get this incredible piece of art out the other end. And it's a bit scary. It's a bit scary because we're all sort of like, oh, so what's the where do we draw this line, and what's computer? What's the original notion of art becoming now? And look, I mean, we don't know where it's going to end, do we? But it's happening, and we have to roll with it, and we have to work with this new frame. It's a new framework for art making. So yeah, I'm very curious to see what happens at the end. Well, my end, I guess, keeps going after that, doesn't it? But I mean, yeah. Thanks, Ada.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much. So finally, we have Rosalind Franklin, and her champion is the Vice Provost and Chief Academic Officer and Professor of Molecular Diagnostics, amongst other things, Paula Shields. And Vera isn't with us. We have a film. I should say that we have taken film of in all the artist studios as they were working. And so we're going to share the short film of Vera to finish off with. But Orla, so I know that, well, I won't give away the punchline. Orla, talk to us about you and Rosalind Franklin, please.
So I'll begin maybe by saying, first of all, thank you. So first of all, for the wonderful evening we had last night. It was this heady mix of sensitive and seismic in equal measure, and it was just such a privilege to be there. And the next thing I would say is that I feel hugely uncomfortable being a champion for Rosalind Franklin. I would concede I'm definitely a fan of the woman, but I mean, she was so remarkable. She just stood for such integrity, and she had this just desire to capture purity of science and, the rigor of good scientific endeavour, and that in itself is a role model. I came across her first as a primary school student, and we had to do a poster on somebody. And I happened across her by accident more than design, and I was just fascinated by the descriptions of her, the fact that she was always seen as a talented outsider. She never really fit in, and yet she forged her niche. And she, from an early age, knew she wanted to be a scientist. This is the only similarity. I knew I wanted to be a scientist. And so it was wonderful to be able to follow what she did and look in amazement, and to be very fortunate to end up working on the same molecules as she discovered and had the first sort of true understanding of. So she, as a young girl, was very, very talented. She was a prodigious student, really. She studied at Cambridge. She studied physics and chemistry. And then she worked in the the Coal Board Research Association. So she worked on graphite and coal molecules, and she got her PhD from Cambridge doing that. And then she went to Paris for a couple of years, and that's where she discovered X-ray crystallography, and she honed her skills and brought them back to King's College London, and that's where she did that famous work. And there's a sentence in the Nature publication from April 1953, which is possibly one of the greatest scientific understatements you could imagine. And it says, "This structure has novel features which may have considerable biological interest." Now, it's important to say that was written by James Watson and Crick, and that was their seminal paper. In that same edition was Rosalind Franklin's description of photograph 51, this beautiful, beautiful X-ray crystallography photograph, which was generated through exposure of the DNA that she had extracted to X-ray beam bombardment for 100 hours. And it's important to mention that because it speaks to why she died so young. In doing her research, she was exposed to those ionizing radiation, and so her very, very early demise is absolutely intricately woven with that work that she did. But it's interesting that her paper is in that same edition, and that was done by the editors, on purpose, because her work corroborated that sentence. And what she didn't know, and what I suppose none of us maybe know for certain, but many speculate, was that the fact that Watson and Crick had perhaps access to her unpublished photographs was what allowed them to hypothesize their theory. And then the role her paper in that same edition served was to corroborate and to give validity to their hypothesis. So it's challenging to talk about that and to see how the work she did wasn't given its true merit at the time. And sadly, obviously Watson, Crick and Maurice Wilkins from King's, they received the Nobel Prize for that work. She was dead by the time that award was given out in the early 60s. So it's very poignant for me to be here talking about her. But I went on then, I studied biomedical science. My two favourite molecules are DNA and RNA. And RNA is what Rosalind Franklin went on to work on. And the work that she did in RNA is some of the seminal work, the fundamental work on the structural biology of viruses. And that's the work that enabled the vaccines that we all benefited from in the last year or so. So her work has this ongoing, perpetuating legacy, whether it's in the DNA sector or in functional genomics using RNA. So she's a phenomenally powerful woman. And some years back, and this is, I think, the punchline Helen was referring to, I had one of those vagaries, and I decided I would, probably because of the area in science I was working in, I decided to go back and look at medical law and biomedical ethics, and I studied that in King's in London. And going into the law school at the time was in Somerset House, for anybody who knows, a lovely, lovely part of London. And as you go through the arch, Catherine Eula, the court hall is just to the right, you go through the arch, and straight in front of you is this building with a plaque on it. It says, "This is the building in which the X-ray crystallography work that, discovered the structure of DNA was done on the bottom by Rosalind Franklin." And it was just so moving as a scientist, there for a different reason, but to be drawn back yet again to this fundamental truism of the work that she had done. And that's what really inspires me about her. And also just this, as I've said, her integrity in science, her dependence only on data. She wouldn't speculate. She had to have data to underpin her findings. And the other thing that she always aspired for was knowledge that would better the lot of mankind. So not just knowledge for knowledge's sake, but something that would change us for the good. So if that weren't enough, I think that's possibly where I'll stop. But I'm a huge fan.
Paulie, you really brought her alive for us there. I think we'll go straight on to Vera's the film.
That's Rosalind Franklin, or at least my version of her. Yeah, that's the finished bust, and all three pieces. So it's all separate: the socle, the torso, and the head. One of my worries was that I didn't want her make her look like a porcelain doll. You know, I didn't want her to be perfect and just kind of soft focus washed over. So I wanted her to look more real. So I wanted the texture here to be quite real, but also the skin. If you look at it closely, it's not completely smooth. She has loads of pores, and that was really important for me, because if you have a pretty lady, it kind of becomes decorative real quickly. The bottom is just a straightforward marble socle. I came up with my own design, sort of based slightly on the idea of the double helix of DNA. So it's just 10 rotated discs, but I think the kind of the way it swirls around made me think of that double helix, a geometric pattern, which is what she would have dealt with in her work a lot. The torso is made from jesmonite. I made the torso in clay and I dressed it up with fabric. So I had to make her top out of fabric, which was a bit challenging, as I don't have that much experience with it. With the fabric, I wanted to go into a pattern. Is a reference to that kind of, well, the pattern, but also the double helix structure of DNA is kind of, well, captured in that a little bit. I tried a lot of different fabrics. I did want to capture her style. Every person has their own sense in fashion and the way they dress, and so I did want to capture that in some way. She has that necklace in quite a lot of the pictures. Looking at the photos, I was astonished how friendly and relaxed she was looking, because from doing research on her, it wasn't easy for her, and I know she had a lot of conflict with colleagues, and her work was then used in the discovery of the structure of DNA, and she wasn't really credited for it. She doesn't look bitter. She kind of looks at ease with herself. I probably went for an early 30s version of her, because she was quite a good-looking woman, and why not reflect that in the bust? I like to think that as a woman I bring a maybe different sensitivity to it. I wanted her to stand out a bit, to make her individual, and well, I hope she can hold her place.
So, ladies and gentlemen, bang on 1 o'clock. We can get the VP up to the hospital. Thank you all so much for coming. I just want to give my absolute heartfelt thanks to our artists and to our scholarly champions. You have absolutely brought these 4 phenomenal women to life with a depth. I've learnt so much, and I just want to thank you all so much for your contribution, and particularly to our artists. Thank you so much.